myself and my colleagues have gone through every single line by line, but we're happy for you to take us through that. And we have a summary of planning evidence from Mr. Willis as well. Did we have any other bits of paper as well?
That was all we intended to have.
That's great. And we have your original submission and other material as well. So we'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As you've already figured out, Mr. Lowe is on my left and Mr. Willis is on my right. I'm going to ask, when Mr. Lowe presents his evidence, I'm going to ask him just to read the executive summary in his pre-circulated evidence, which is quite short. I suppose the question for you, Mr. Chair, is having that indication, would it assist you if I read my submissions, or would you prefer if I pulled the eyes out of them?
I prefer you to pull the eyes and ears, yes.
Indeed. So, so the starting point is that Lowe Corporation is a regionally significant industrial producer of meat byproduct processing facilities at Taumoana and Whakatū. It's also got a development site at Whakatū. Those are the three sites that its submission focuses on, and all three have access to the Hiratonga aquifer. They have existing bores, one for each site. Well, as I say in my submissions and in Mr. Lowe's evidence, there's a process of progressive consolidation of byproduct processing capacity, both from outside the region and within the region, to the company's primary processing plant at Coventry Road in Taumoana. We've got detailed water use figures in Mr. Lowe's evidence showing a progressive increase in the Coventry Road water take, which I've called the GLH plant, and a corresponding reduction in water use at the Pandora plant that has recently been mothballed and was on Napier City Supply, and from the Hawke's Bay Pelts plant at Whakatū. So there's a rebalancing of water use going on, water use going up in some locations and down in others. So I've summarised the submission in my paragraph 9. I'll talk about the points that we're not pursuing. While we believe conceptually there's good grounds to provide greater policy focus on groundwater takes to provide that impact surface water levels more directly and more quickly, we don't have technical evidence, and we're not going to pursue something we don't have technical evidence to support. I draw the parallel with the concept that Mr. Tiuka described in his evidence for Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. of having separate management regimes for the confined and unconfined aquifer. That seems to be a more blunt way to doing that, but we don't know how that would work. We've got no idea whether it would be practical, and Mr. Tiuka didn't describe that. We're also no longer pursuing a requested increase in overall allocation limit. But more generally, that any material reduction or increase in the interim allocation limit currently in the plan change would need to be supported by a Section 32AA evaluation. I'd note that Mr. Fraser's evidence for Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. Critiques the Regional Council's Section 32 allocation, but he doesn't present an evaluation of his own that would support a lower limit as sought in that submission. Now, the principal point, going to paragraph 15, the principal point that I want to canvass in these submissions is the rejection of Lowe Corporation's submission seeking provision for increased water demand from regionally significant industry. I suggest that council staff have not addressed this point satisfactorily. Neither the Section 42A report nor the addendum report address the company's contention that Plan Change 9 draws an unsustainable distinction between municipal water takes and regionally significant industry that supplies its own water from the Heritonga Aquifer. So the next section I deal with the provisions of the plan change as recommended. They be varied by the addendum, the staff addendum report that provide a priority for municipal water takes. Principally, that's given effect through Policy 50, which relates to municipal and Papakainga water supply. Emphasise that Low Corporation has no issue with a priority for drinking water and other essential personal use. That's almost so obvious it goes without saying. The issue we have is that through these policy mechanisms, industry supplied from either of the two municipal networks can continue to grow, at least within the limits of the Council's global water take consents, whereas low corporations' operations are subject to the actual and reasonable use restriction based on their historic water use. Now, looking as to what the staff have said about why there is an exception for municipal use expressed in the way it is, I quoted the 42A report. The only exception from actual and reasonable use are for consents such as those held by TLAs for municipal use, which have not been fully utilised due to staged development. And then there's a separate discussion about limiting the councils to historical water use could impede Hastings District Napier City in fulfilling their legal obligations in providing for future growth. Separately, it's clear that the legal obligations it's talking about are those in the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, 2020. So, looking at those two reasons for an exception, my submission is that given Mr Lowe's evidence, the Low Corporation's consents are clearly consents providing for staged development. That's certainly how they're being used. So we have the Whakatū development land, which is still not been developed. So that stage one is yet to get off the ground for reasons that Mr Lowe describes in his evidence. You look at the Coventry Road plant, which has got a staged increases. Mr Lowe can talk to you if you're interested about what he envisages going into the future, although obviously there's a degree of speculation in that. And you look at the Whakatū pelt producers plant, which has a staged reduction. So it's all staged development in terms of the explanation in the 42A report. And then you go to the NPSUD. I imagine that you have heard extensively about the Regional Council's obligations, and therefore your obligation standing in the shoes of the Regional Council to implement the NPS FM. My submission, the NPSUD is exactly the same. You have the same obligations to implement it. I draw attention in my submissions to the fact that in my submission, the 42A report understates the obligations. As I quoted them, it was expressed as an obligation or as a desire not to put the councils in a position which would impede their ability to comply with the NPSUD. My submission is that that understates the position, because if you look in the appendix, Hawke's Bay Regional Council is described or defined as a Tier 2 local authority. So every legal obligation that says Tier 2 local authorities must do certain things, and the NPSUD applies equally to the regional council. So I quote in my submissions from some of these provisions of the NPSUD. Section 3.3, every Tier 1, 2 and 3 local authority must provide at least sufficient development capacity in its regional district to meet the expected demand for business land. Business land includes industrial land. My submission, if there's insufficient water to supply a site, in the case of wet industry, that's processed water, or insufficient wastewater treatment capacity to manage wastewater from the site, it cannot in practice be developed. So the proposed plan refers to HPUDs, the development strategy for the Heretaunga Plains. That document identifies Taumoana and Whakatū as the areas where wet industry will locate. In my submission, to state the obvious, wet industry cannot locate or intensify in the situation of insufficient or inconsistent water supply. And I submit that the hearing panel is required as a matter of law, because you stand in the shoes of the Regional Council, to ensure that your actions, at the very least, do not prevent demand for wet industry development in the Taumoana and Whakatū areas being met, and thereby frustrate implementation of the NPSUD. I cite Mr. Willis's evidence. There's no grounds for drawing a distinction between industry that's supplied from municipal supply and industry that supplies itself, and I say that he's understating it. There's good reason to prefer self-supplied industry, because it's likely to be a much more efficient use of water. If you're taking from a bore already on the site, you don't have a situation where it's funneled through the entire municipal network, multiple water losses along the way to when it finally gets to its destination. In terms of the rhetorical question, you say, well, is Low Corporation looking to be identical to a council? No, it's not. It's not seeking to put itself completely on the same par as the councils. Mr. Willis is recommending provisions that would have the result that a low corporation application to renew its existing consents and take more water than, quote, actual and reasonable use would be considered as a full discretionary activity. That's opposed to a restricted discretionary activity that the councils would have. But that would ensure that all of the competing considerations under the NPSFM would be on the table. I emphasise that Low Corporation's not seeking a free pass, but it's just looking to put in place a consenting pathway that would enable proper consideration of its demand for future water use. I spend some time looking at scope issues because the way in which Council for the Regional Council put his opening submissions, he's drawing attention to the need for submissions to be on the plan change. But in my submission he provides no insight as to the situation where in his submission that might actually apply. I've suggested that that's less than helpful and creates a potential breach of the rules of natural justice should council seek to present an argument that, for instance, the submissions I'm presenting are not on Plan Change 6. However, in the time-honoured manner, getting my retaliation in first, my submission, the relief that Low Corporation seeking was perfectly obvious from its submission, perfectly clear, that I've submitted that it was directly focused on the extent to which Plan Change 9 alters the status quo, that is to say, alters it to impose the actual and reasonable use target, addressing the second limb of the legal test, whether there's a real risk that people affected might be not appreciated. I've analysed some of the cases. I've drawn attention to the difference between the motor machinists and Clearwater Resort decisions that Council for the Regional Council relies on, and a decision of Justice Fotter in relation to the Auckland Unitary Plan, where Justice Fotter said it all depends on the scope of the plan change. In a complete review, such as the Unitary Plan, very difficult to see how you could not be on the Unitary Plan because it covered everything. Whereas both motor machinists and Clearwater were quite narrow in focus. They were geographically limited. Clearwater was about airport noise contours at Christchurch Airport. Motor machinists was about an expansion of zones on the outskirts of the Palmerston North City Centre to particular identified areas. So my submission is a spectrum. Those are at either end. And so here, looking at paragraph 60, while it's confined to the 4 river catchments, that's a big area. And the plan change is extremely wide in scope. I agree with Council for the Regional Council that a submission couldn't seek to alter the regional policy statement, but regional policy statement components of the regional plan. But in practice, the objectives, policies and rules applying to water quality and water quantity within all 4 catchments are all clearly on the table. So in terms of the comparison of a spectrum, this is somewhere between those two, the outliers of a geographically limited land use change and a complete review. So my punchline is that I submit that there's no technical objection that could be made to the relief sought in low corporations evidence. As I say, I don't know if it was low corporations evidence that Council had in mind when he raised the issue. I'm just responding on the off chance. The other issue of scope is that the relief people seek in this hearing can't expand on the relief sought in their original submission. I agree completely with his statement of position. I make the practical point that, practical suggestion that the hearing panel should be wary of both legal counsel and expert witnesses who speak at length about what they want from the plan change but make no reference to the submission on which they rely, because while you can't say that everyone does it, typically people do that because they don't want to draw attention to the differences between the two. I also submit that Council for EDS was incorrect when they suggested that Plan Change 9 must give effect to the NPS FM regardless of the content and extent of the submissions. I talk about the Tuki Plan Change appeal that I have some familiarity with. That was a case where the NPS FM 2014 was released after the Board of Inquiry's decision had been appealed. The High Court said, having decided that the appeal was made out and it should be referred back to the Board of Inquiry, that the Board should apply the new NPS FM, but only in respect of the matters referred back. That was because that was all the Board of Inquiry would have jurisdiction to consider. In other words, in my submission, the NPSFM 2020 in this case does not create jurisdiction that wouldn't otherwise exist. It creates a reason for doing something, but it doesn't create jurisdiction. Council for EDS submitted the alternative that there are submissions directly addressing the need for Plan Change 9 to give effect to the NPSFM. My submission, it's not sufficient for a submission to frame the relief sought broadly as a request to implement the NPSFM. So I draw the comparison between that and submissions that seek or complain that a plan change doesn't give effect to the principles, purpose and principles of the RMA and seek as relief that it should do so. I submit that the submission is meaningless without specification of what changes are required in order, in this case, to give effect to the NPSFM. Going back to the scope principles, the need for people to be able to understand what you're seeking, that kind of generally framed relief gives potentially interested third parties no ability to participate meaningfully in the first schedule process because they can't understand the implications of your submission. So I submit at paragraph 68 that to allow parties to make very general submissions and then in effect decide at a later stage what they actually want is contrary both to the principles of natural justice and to the requirements of the first schedule. So going on to actual and reasonable use, it's been a winding path. The original Low Corporation's original submission was that as notified, the provision or the definition of actual and reasonable use offended against the common law rules against retrospective regulatory provisions, working on a basis for, ending in 2017, and sought to hide behind language which obscured the true intent. That, of course, is a current practice at many levels of using terms that are then defined to mean something quite different, and one need only go to the simplifying and streamlining amendment to the RMA that did neither of those things. So the issue for a low corporation, as Mr. Lowe demonstrates in the water use figures that he produces, is that the GLH plant at Tamoana has been increasing in stages and has increased since 2017 in water use since 2017. So adopting the notified cut-off of 1 August 2017 would significantly constrain production at that plant, calling into question the consolidation of production into Coventry Road that the company has undertaken. The 42A report recommended that the retrospective element be removed, but the provision in the definition saying it was peak use over a 10-year period be altered to an average. Our evidence discusses that at length because that has significant adverse effects on low corporations' position. In effect, it assumes a steady state position, and neither the Whakatū development site nor the Coventry Road production site are in a steady state. We'd also had a significant problem with the classification of that change as a consequential change, but fortunately I don't have to address you at length on that because the staff in their addendum report have recommended that it revert to the peak use in the 10 years to 2 May. However, Low Corporation supports that outcome, but notes that the ambiguity identified in its submission remains unresolved because the same language has been carried over. What is a year? It could be the calendar year. Water use permits typically are July to June years, could be that, and so the final year would be a part year, or it could be 3 May to 2 May years. Those are the sort of issues that end up in the Environment Court in declaration proceedings, and I observe that it's somewhat frustrating that the council don't appear to have taken on board that it's an issue, still less told us what the correct answer is and why. So I see it's just turning the page that I omitted to mention the point made in my footnote that although the staff have moved off the average Mr Tuuka for Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. Presents another alternative, being the lowest annual use in the previous 10 years. That would obviously have an even greater problem for Low Corporation. The lowest use in the last 10 years at the Whakatū development site is nil. I draw attention in my footnote, there's no Section 32AA evaluation of that relief, and I'm not going to be bold and say there is no submission, but I couldn't find one that supported that relief. And certainly Mr Tuuka didn't cross-reference where in the authority's submission it was addressed. But going back, so that's just interpolation, on the interpretation issue, what is a year? Mr Willis suggests that it just be made clear that it's any 12-month period in the 10 years prior to 2 May. That is one answer. There are innumerable other answers. The key thing is to be clear what you mean. I dealt briefly with efficient water use. Staff have recommended that the Low Corporation relief be granted, effectively not assuming that efficiency will necessarily lead to reductions in water use. Mr Lowe describes that his production plants are in the process of benchmarking themselves to international standards that include as to efficiency. So he thinks they're efficient already. And if they're not, they will be by the time this plan is in place. Looking lastly to Streamflow Augmentation, I deal first with the provision in the notified plan. It said if you didn't augment your plan when a trigger was, if you didn't augment a stream in accordance with the requirements of the plan, when a surface flow trigger was hit, groundwater take had to cease. I observed that that fails to take account of the time lags within the groundwater system, detailed in the technical reports that the Regional Council staff prepared supporting the plan change. So you could easily get a situation where groundwater takes are forced to cease, but by the time that has any beneficial effect on surface water flows, they've recovered and sit above the trigger. So the retirement to cease water take in those circumstances potentially serves little resource management purpose other than to act as a particularly blunt club, forcing groundwater users to implement the alternative of streamflow management, maintenance and habitat enhancement. And I draw attention to the obvious practical questions how an individual water taker like Low Corporation located in the lower part of the relevant surface water catchments could put such a scheme for stream enhancement in place and augment stream flows further upstream, even if the required operating parameters were clear which they were not. Low Corporation submitted that the council itself was in a position to drive creation of such schemes on a large scale. I've talked about in my submissions about the consequences if the notified provisions were to remain in place. If they didn't work, then that would put Low Corporation in the position of reopening the question of having consolidated production at Pandora to Hastings, whether that should be reversed because it could use Napier City water, which isn't subject to the same requirements, or if it is, that's Napier City's problem, or alternatively to look at the practicability of shifting the production back out of the region that's having been consolidated into Hawke's Bay. So I've described that as a classic good idea in theory. It's not viable in the complex physical situation of the Hiratonga Plains, with multiple interactions between different surface water bodies and the groundwater resource, and many more parties with different interests and water users. So Low Corporation supports the revised version now recommended by council staff, indicating a council commitment to take the initiative in devising a solution in consultation with all interested parties. I won't take you through my conclusion, but I will briefly address the suggestions of Council for Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. and EDS that Plan Change 9 be withdrawn or declined if it's not amended in the manner those parties seek. My submission is that the power of withdrawal is a separate administrative power held by the Regional Council. You as the hearing panel would only have the power to withdraw the plan change if that statutory power were specifically delegated to you. I don't know whether it has or not, but that would be a question. That is preparatory to any consideration of the merits of withdrawing it, the plan change. You do have the power to delete provisions from the notified plan. That logically includes the power to delete the entire plan, leaving the operative provisions still in place, provided a submission sought that outcome. I think there were probably submissions that would qualify, but assuming there is scope, that's a revision to the notified plan that requires evaluation under section 32AA, including consideration of the costs and benefits of doing so. Low Corporation's position is that it would prefer to optimise the existing investment. Put simply, if the council was going to abandon the plan change, it would have been helpful if it did so before everybody committed to this process and all the expense and involved with it. So having got this far, particularly given the council investment in the process, we prefer to optimise that investment, get the best possible plan change in place, while acknowledging that in the seemingly ever-changing freshwater space, further plan changes appear almost inevitable. Those are my submissions, Mr. Chair. Happy, of course, to answer questions now or at the end, at your option.
We're just going to take one and then we'll wait till the end and we'll ask the rest of the questions.
Very happy.
Can I take you to your paragraph 80, please, Mr. Robinson?
80?
80.
Yes, indeed.
So if the definition were to make it clear that references to years mean any 12-month period, so that could be from 8th of June this year to 8th of June the previous year, or it could be to 18th of November, from 18 November 2018 to 18 November 2019. Is that what you're saying?
No, I apologise. The précis was too short. The words that Mr Willis suggested, from my recollection, are any 12-month period in the 10 years to May 2020.
So that would be the year ending 2 May in each case.
Well, not necessarily, any 12-month period. So you could, that is one option. That his suggestion is that so long as it's 12 months long and it's within the 10-year window, that is enough, but you could be more precise. You could, as I say, you could say it's the July to June year, and in the case of the year to May, it's the part year. My concern is not what the ultimate end game, because I haven't analysed the numbers. I can tell you frankly, I haven't analysed the numbers to know which one would most advantage local operation, because my submission is that the important thing is to be clear what it means. And how exactly you define which years you're talking about is less important than being clear about what is a year for this purpose.
Whether it's a calendar year or a water year, and I agree that's not clear.
Or something else, as I say, it could be 3 May to 2 May, like the way it's written, that would be your starting point, and you'd say, well, is that what's intended? I suspect, because most irrigators are finished by May, it's less of an issue for the irrigators. But for a 24/7 operation like local operation, it potentially makes a big difference.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
We'll continue with the presentation.
We're up to Mr Lowe. As I said, I will ask Mr Lowe only to read his executive summary and then leave it to you to ask questions. Mr Lowe, would you care to read from paragraph 6?
I'll just start by saying, if you might go to paragraph 23, we're going to state.
Oh yes, show. They should have done that.
Should be, that's rules from 4, not making council.
Oh, I couldn't quite hear you, Mr Lowe.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry, I turned it off, not on. So, para 23 is the Aotearoa rendering plant, interest in the above, draws water from a bore, not the Napier City Council.
Okay.
Executive summary, para 6. Lowe operates regionally significant industrial processing facilities at Timona and Wakatu. Availability of processed water within existing consent limits is a critical element in Lowe's existing Hawke's Bay operations. It will also be essential in industry zoned land Lowe currently owns at Wakatu is to be developed for wet industry. As I understand, it's provided for in the relevant RMA plans and strategies. Lowe's existing Hastings plant is within the Hastings urban zone. I don't understand why Plan Change 9 restricts its stage expansion when industrial plants supplied with water by Hastings District Council and Napier City Councils are able to expand. Lowe has pursued a deliberate policy of consolidation of production capacity to its Hastings plant, both from outside the region and inside. From its now mothballed plant at Pandora and Napier and from its TPP plant at Wakatu, the result locally has been a reduced water take at Wakatu and a reduction in demand for Hastings City Council water at Pandora site. along with a staged increase in its Hastings water demand. The amendments recommended by council staff to the plan change process around actual and reasonable use were specifically limited to the future use of the average water use in the 10 years to May. From significantly constrained Hastings operations at current actual levels and provide a persuasive increase to reverse the consolidation process. Low Water strives to use water efficiently. It is an area of continual improvement in plant operations.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. We've had the chance to read your evidence, so we might just pause there and have Mr. Willis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I just start by making one correction to my evidence, if I may? I won't go through all the minor bits and pieces, but there is one that's quite significant, I think. If I just take you to paragraph 71, it's just a two-line paragraph. And here I'm responding, and this is a critical point, as I say, which is why I'm drawing your attention to it. Here I'm responding to the suggestion from the 42A report that making the changes that the Low Corporation submission seeks would not allow council to meet its obligations under the freshwater NPS, which is obviously quite a significant a bar to proceeding with the planning argument, if that is the case. And so I said in paragraph 71, whether that's true and correct depends entirely on whether PC9 would achieve compensating reductions in allocation across other users and sectors. And on reflection, indeed, that's actually not a correct statement, because it doesn't depend entirely on that at all. And I'd just like to change it if I could. So rather than, if we could strike out the word entirely, and after the word on, I'd just like to say A, or one, where the compensating reductions are achieved, and then at the end of that sentence, B would be, and I'll try and keep this slow so you get the point, whether keeping users at actual and reasonable use would provide headroom for growth within the allocation limit. And I'll perhaps return to that as I just come through my summary, but that's, as I say, it's such a critical point. I wanted to make it early on if I could.
Could you just state that last part?
Sorry.
The B?
Yes, so B, whether keeping users at actual and reasonable use would provide headroom for growth within the allocation limit. And that's important in relation to the evidence, the council evidence of Mr. Waldron, which I will come on to, if you like, where he indicates that there is, in a recalculation of existing usage, whether there in fact headroom with a 90 million cubic metre allocation limit. So, as I say, I will return to that in a moment. Thank you for that. Okay, I was just going to plan, Mr. Chair, if I may, just to read through the two-pager that I've got, a summary that I think hopefully has been circulated to you. I do apologise in advance too. I noticed that the font is unusually small, and I must admit I found it quite difficult to read myself. So
it's not the smallest I've seen.
I don't quite know how that happened, but anyway, my apologies.
It is 11 points.
Actually, I better ask my fellow commissioners to my right. That's right, they've got the glasses on.
Yeah.
Proceed.
So my evidence addresses those provisions of PC9 that would prevent Low Corp gaining replacement groundwater take permits for its, and I should change that to 4 actually, 4 self-supporting industry sites. As Mr. Lowe just pointed out, the Awatoto site, in fact, isn't supplied by the municipal, but is in fact a bore, as we've recently discovered on the So it's allow them to replace those consents on conditions that would enable the continuation and further development of those sites for their efficient use. So I guess the first point I'm making in para 2 here is that I support the a planning response that would phase out groundwater over allocation in the Hiratonga Plains in accordance with the NPSFM. I think that's obvious and undeniable. However, I do not consider that to be necessarily inconsistent with allowing a low corporation to take and use water in quantities that exceed their current use. The NPSFM's obligation to avoid and phase out over-allocation is to avoid over-allocation at the water body scale, not to stop any and every existing user ever increasing its water take. And this is the point that I just raised a moment ago. I note that the addendum report to the hearing report, the one dated the 19th of May, notes that while my evidence acknowledges that allowing low corp to increase its take relative to current use, but still within its consented use, might require another user or user group to take a bigger hit, to use a colloquial expression, but that I do not specify which users should take a hit. And I just thought it would be useful perhaps to respond to that. And my response is from a planning perspective. I guess the first one is that, you know, the starting point for determining who gets water and who gets what priority in water ought to be the higher order planning policy. I think from a planning perspective, that's a given. And in that regard, the NPSFUD, as Mr. Robinson talked about, is highly relevant. And I note in my paragraph 63 that section 3.3 of the NPSUD requires the Regional Council to provide sufficient development capacity for business land, and that land must be plan ready and infrastructure enabled, to use a couple of terms that are defined. I won't bore you with the definitions, but are defined within that NPS. The NPSFM, section 3.5, requires that the Regional Council adopt an integrated approach to water management that encourages the coordination and sequencing of regional or urban growth. So when you put those things together, it seems to be that not allowing for the expansion of growth in localities that are identified, both in a district plan and in this case the HPUD strategy, for such a use does not seem to be to promote integrated management. And I think you need to take a broad understanding of what that meant, that we are trying to do things in an aligned and joined up fashion. My second point here is that beyond that, of course, Council has a section 32 duty to ensure efficiency, including allocative efficiency. And I'd also just elaborate here that, of course, Objective 1 and Policy 1 of the RPS, to which it must give effect, talk about achieving allocative efficiency or efficient allocation. So it is part of the broader framework. And look, I guess the third point here is that even setting aside my opinion that the low corporation sites deserve some priority based on a higher order planning direction, there is clear evidence, in my opinion, in the form of Mr. Waldrom's statement in reply. And if you had that, it was page 9 in his figure 1, which is most pertinent. And that said that that suggested that in 9 of the past 10 years, current use has been estimated or calculated to be below the 90 million cubic metre aquifer interim allocation limit. So the one exceedance that there was in 2012, 2013, and that was driven, of course, by a very high level of irrigation, a severe drought year. And even then, the exceedance was very minor, and it was actually 90.3 million cubic metres, so less than, or just over 0.3% exceedance in that particularly one dry year in that decade of data. So figures, as I say, they're a revision of the data that were originally presented in Appendix 9 of the 42A report. And accordingly, based on that data, it seems to me that there is capacity within the allocation limit, the interim allocation limit, for a degree of, albeit limited, as always, increases from certain priority activities, if the panel was mindful to go that way as we're proposing here. And I should say that actually there is a, I say a limited degree, and it is limited, but there is, it's not marginal. There is still quite significant under, I guess, the current use is in many cases a meaningful degree under the 90 million cubic metre limit. So, I guess more broadly, I consider that the differentiated approach, whereby industry supplied with water from municipal water supply networks may be able to grow their water take, but industry not so supplied may not, is difficult, or in fact not justifiable in resource management terms if you look at the effects of those things. That's especially so, of course, when there's a common source of water. So the distinction just doesn't bear any obvious logical sort of scrutiny to me. Again, though, I note that there's a requirement under Policy 3.3 of the NPSUD for the Regional Council to provide development capacity to meet industrial demand, and that requirement, again, it does not distinguish between providing new industrial land, servicing new industrial land through supply networks, municipal networks, or allowing for the expansion of existing sites that are self-supplied. So I think there's some of the distinctions drawn, perhaps in some of the analysis, isn't based on the actual policy framework. While I accept that a replacement take above actual and reasonable levels is a discretionary activity, and it's not prohibited, I do consider that the policy framework is such that it will be very difficult to consent at a take above actual and reasonable, absent some stronger level of recognition at the policy level for industry needs. So accordingly, my evidence supports amendment principally to Policy 50 that would allow for growth in water take, provided, and these are the key factors, any growth is within the previously consented quantities. The abstractor is a regionally significant industry, which is a new concept, but one which I define and is included in the low corporation submission. And that, of course, is to try and contain this ability to increase. And then, of course, the good industry practice is also used in water use efficiency. And I'll just pause here for a minute. I think the point here is that given the severity of the potential impact on low corporation, I think the ask in planning terms here is actually fairly modest. We're not seeking a change, and I'm not recommending a change in the rule framework. So as the plan currently stands, plan change stands, it would be a discretionary activity to do what low corporation wants to do, which is go above its actual and reasonable take. And we're not proposing that change at all. It would remain a full discretionary activity. All we're seeking is that there's a clearer pathway by which these relevant issues can be brought to the decision-making forum. Further, I think it's relevant to consider the patterns of water use as well. I mean, low corporation perhaps is in a particular situation here with multiple sites, and as has already been explained by Mr. Lowe, some are going up and some are going down. So I think it's relevant in any consent application to consider that pattern of land use. So low corporation provides an example of increased water use at one site, more than counterbalanced by reducing demand on the groundwater resource at other sites. And really in 80, I'm just saying my proposed amendments provide a planning pathway whereby the application to increase take can be assessed on a fair and reasonable basis, taking into account relevant policy considerations. Now, I just also need to say here that there's one slight omission I have to confess in my evidence. The low corporation submission included a proposal to amend slightly Objective 16. Now, I've talked about that in my evidence quite a bit. I've talked about the fact that I don't agree with Objective 16 as it stands, and I support the submission, the wording provided in the low corporation submission. Now, what I omitted to do was actually include that wording in my body of my evidence, but in fact, it certainly is, as I say, included in the evidence. And although I think the wording might be tweaked, I stand behind my support for that submission. Now, the last couple of points here are ones that hopefully we've made some progress on already. So I guess the actual and reasonable test, I propose a change to the definition of actual and reasonable so that it applies to the maximum rather than average, as we've discussed over the period May 2010 to May 2020. Now, I note that Section 42A Addendum Report now agrees that, having reconsidered the level of water use over that 10-year period, and in particular that year 2019 and 2020, which had looked to be an abnormally high year, now does not look to be anything like as high with the recalculation, which makes a difference. And in my opinion, that means applying that maximum approach as per the notified version, if you like, is indeed appropriate. I support this change for the reasons that I set out in the evidence. On this point, I note also that the evidence of Mr. Tiuka for Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Corporation seeks that the actual and reasonable test be defined by reference to the lowest annual take. This is a point Mr. Robinson made as well, in the 10 years to May. And look, I guess I'm repeating it to some extent what Mr. Robinson said, but I'd simply observe that such an approach would further disadvantage low corporation and any other existing abstractor who was not in that sort of steady state mode. For businesses such as low corporation, it would have a very significant consequence on their ability to take water. It would require significant reductions in my analysis of that. And if you looked, for example, at the growing GHL site at Tomoana there, which is the one we've had some quite significant growth in water use in recent years, it would mean that that site would have to reduce by 62% its water use in a site which, as Mr. Lowe said, is where they're sort of trying to concentrate production. And in the case, and I think Mr. Robinson said this too, in the case of the Whakatū development site, which has years with zero water take, of course that would mean that the existing consent becomes effectively unrenewable at any level. So again, the consequences would be really very significant from such a move. And just finally, two matters that I think Mr. Robinson has addressed, and I'll just for completeness cover as well. I support the recommendations that would remove the presumption in Policy 52 that efficiency gains are always possible. As we know, they often are, but aren't always. And so that was important that is removed. And the proposal to delete Policy 39, which is about flow maintenance or the augmentation scheme. And I agree really that was a good idea, that it was difficult to see how it could possibly be implemented in its current state. And I've considered the replacement policy which has been proposed by officers, and it seems to me that's an appropriate place to start that discussion. And that's all, Mr. Chair. I'll happy to leave it there.
Thank you. We might then invite the panel to make questions of any one or all of you. Do you want to start, Greg?
I just want to clarify your figures 1, 2 and 3 in your evidence in chief, which are the volumes of water taken by low corporation from its.
Yes.
Are they, you've got them drawn as lines, but are they actual discrete volumes per year?
Yeah, I could have done them as a bar chart, yes. I was just trying to show the trend line more than anything.
I just wanted to make sure that those actual those numbers are is the annual amount taken each.
Yes, they are.
year.
Yeah, sorry, you're probably right. It probably was better to have done it as a bar chart, but they are. Each of those points is a discrete volume taken as reported from. I think we've got the data from council. So
Okay. And just a question. You referred to, I think it was Mr. Waldron's Appendix 10 to the Officer's Addendum report, when his Figure 1 with the ground water allocation estimates since 2010-11, you're saying that there's only 1 year there were, I think it's 2012 and 13, where the allocation went slightly over 90 million cubic metres. And so you're, if I'm correct in understanding your argument, you're implying that there could be even more headroom available to take more groundwater out than typically is the occasion in any one year. Is that correct?
There could be, yes.
And would that not serve to lower groundwater levels even lower than they currently exist?
Well, if you're taking out more, then that would be the case, one imagines. But I guess I was looking simply about being able to work within the 90 million cubic metre cap, rather than looking at the technical detail of the levels. But that would be a consideration, as I say. I'm suggesting that it's a full discretionary consent, so it's not an automatic right. It's simply a matter that can be considered. And it seems to me there would be some scope to consider that, given those data presented.
All right. All right, I understand it now. Thank you. That's all I've got at the moment.
Mr. Willis, can I take you to your paragraphs 84 and 85 of your evidence in chief?
Yes.
So one of the things we're hearing consistently from every sector is that we're some sort of special case, and I'll give you vineyards as a particular example. As I would read your definition, proposed definition of regionally significant industry, means an economic activity based on the use of natural and physical resources in a region that has been shown to have benefits that are significant at a regional or national scale. So that would embrace, as I would read it, vineyards, apples, a number of other activities that would assert that regionally they're significant. And the breadth of a definition like that, I think, would be strongly favoured by a lot of those industry groups. But I don't think it gives your particular client any kind of treatment greater than those other industries.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of ways to look at this, Commissioner, isn't there? I mean, I would have... It's always... You're quite... I mean, I understand the point, that everyone's going to argue they're important, and if the definition's broad enough, then everyone will be able to argue they're important, and I get that. I think what I had been how I'd been interpreting that statement is that one couldn't be a small producer and point to the fact you're part of a large industry. You have to be a large user and large producer in your own right, is the way I would have probably read that. But, you know, there are, as we know with planning provisions, there are always multiple ways to read them. That's probably the thought that was in my mind. Whether the wording can be improved, possibly. And economic activity, I guess, was the point I was emphasising in that statement.
Okay. And my second question is the actual and reasonable test doesn't do a lot for your client because he hasn't used a great deal of water over the last 10 years. I think he's consented for 2.25 million, and actual use I think is 800,000 or 900,000. If that's the actual use over 10 years, isn't that a reasonable starting point for what should be a relatively straightforward consenting pathway, because you still have the discretionary activity pathway available to go over and above that?
You do, that's the point I guess I was making, but if you look at when you go through the other policies that would be taken into account, I think it would still be quite a difficult point to argue that just because you had consents for a higher volume in the past, you should get a higher volume now. I didn't see anything in that framework that would, I immediately thought I would make that argument should I be working on such an application. So I think you're right, it does make a good starting point, but I'm not sure that the framework allows you to take that into account, absent the sort of changes that I've been suggesting here.
So are you talking about policy 52 in particular there?
Just have a quick look at that. Yes.
Thank you.
Cool. I've got several questions. The first one, I'm just going to use these sequentially. This is in your brief of evidence, Mr. Lowe, at paragraph 40, under the title Efficient Water Use. It's in the second sentence, the working group has approved our Hawke's Bay setup generally, and we are working towards achieving a position of water use in line with international standards. So I'm just focusing on the term international standards. And either yourself or members of the team, just explain to me what's meant by international standards.
Well, the Leather Working Group is a group of tenors who are set up for supply chain of worldwide sustainability, and water usage is one of their criteria. So we're working closely with them to be in line with worldwide standards that they're setting.
And the relationship of those standards with the provisions in the plan, proposed plan? Is there a correlation between the two?
No. Not that I understand. They're independent to the council.
I understand that. It's just that making a statement saying that it's going to be in line with international standards, so I'm just wondering, is that relevant to proposed plan change 9 or the framework of the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water?
I think it's just a statement saying that we're working to best standards for, we're working to best standards for water usage.
Okay, thank you.
If I could pick up on that,
Sure.
Mr. Chair, I think the point is not that it's going to correlate, but that if the company is working to international standards, there's a limit to how much more it will be achieved applying the plan provisions when the consents are rolled over. That's the point.
Okay.
It's a practical issue about if we're already there, if local corporation is already operating efficiently, there's a limit to how much more juice you can squeeze out of this particular orange.
I get your point. Thank you. Just turning to Mr. Willis's evidence. This is a question in a similar vein to the regionally significant industry, and I just wanted to be clear, this definition and approach is, you're thinking from your client's perspective, a better way of describing the industry and the priority as opposed to necessarily as a direct result of the MPS urban development.
I think it's probably fair to say that this idea was predominantly promoted as a way of trying to give assurance to council and wider stakeholders that this wasn't a free-for-all for all activities who just felt like they wanted to increase water use above current use. And it was meant to say, well, there are some industries that are particularly important for the well-being of this community, and where we can make more water available for them, then that ought to be a priority for us. As I agree, the definition, it may look familiar to one or two of you. It's come out of the Waikato plan with some minor amendment.
Okay,
But a similar concept is used there for similar purposes.
thank you, that's helpful. The next one's just regards legal submissions. It's just so I'm clear in my mind, Mr. Robinson. It's just around the scope of the submissions where they refer to the MPS FM 2020, and I just want to be really clear in my mind what your submissions are. So,
My submission is that a plea for relief saying plan change needs to be consistent with and implement NPS FM is not sufficiently specific.
Yes, yes, that's right.
What I'm saying is it needs to go on. It needs to implement the NPS FM by doing X, Y, Z.
Yes, and that's what I was looking for in terms of that's in my head, that's what you're saying.
That is exactly what I'm saying. If, for instance, Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. clearly made a submission seeking a 70 million cube interim limit, so did the Hiratonga Taiwhenua. That is clearly, you couldn't be more specific than that. But saying you should implement the NPS FM and then rocking up and saying something entirely different, well, what does that mean? That is my point.
Yeah, no, that point well made, thank you. I'll just check if I've got any other ones here. Reduced, yes. Yes. Date. Oh, this one was really just a note, just in terms of those delegations. We've been given a very general provision of delegations to make the decision, so it hasn't been specific in regards to withdrawal, so we'll get further advice on that one. I think that was all my questions. Do we have any other questions? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
legal counsel, can I just take you back to your paragraph 102? You say you were addressing the suggestion from Ngāti Kahungunu and the Environmental Defence Society to withdraw or decline the proposal. But you know, and then you tell us what powers there are to do just that. But I'm more interested in what your views are on the actual suggestions that were being made by Kahungunu and the Defence Society. Any particular reasons why? Because you then come to the conclusion that no, we shouldn't do that because LCL still wants to do what it does.
No, I think I should correct the impression I've obviously given you, Commissioner. It's more a plea that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That while LCL is here making submissions about how this plan change should change, or not change as the case may be, it's much more that we're better to stick with this process than to start again and lose the investment. Now, you may be convinced by the case that Ngāti Kahungunu, for instance, has put to you. There are aspects of that case that LCL has opposed. It hasn't opposed all aspects, and so first of all, the submission about remedy is independent of result. What we're saying is that we would prefer this process to run to a conclusion, whatever that conclusion may be, than to start again, waste the investment that's already been put into it, and come again in however many years and rerun everything. The second point, in terms of your invitation to make comment on the relief, the merits of the relief sought, for instance, by Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Inc. I need to be careful because, having said that I agree with Council for the Regional Council that we only have scope to address things that are within the LCL submission, that includes further submission. LCL didn't make a further submission on the iwi incorporated submission. It did make a further submission, or series of further submissions, on the Hiratonga Taiwhenua submission, many of which are similar in nature and which overlap. So certainly, I think that I'm within scope to say that LCL would oppose the reduction of the overall interim limit to 70 million cubes. I've suggested to you that this matter hasn't produced adequate evidence to justify that, hasn't given you the material you would need to undertake a Section 32AA evaluation of that change. But in terms of the detail of the Ngāti Kahungunu, I don't think I'm in a position to address you. I don't think I have scope to do that.
Okay. Thank you. And just one other question for Mr. Willis. In 3.2 of your brief statement, the one that was just given, you referred to the issue of allocative efficiency. And I'd be interested in just hearing you expand on that a little bit more. I mean, you use as your example scale of the industry in which you operate. I guess I'm as interested in that as I am about the broader community implications or impacts that allocative efficiency operates within.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I guess I'm a planner and not an economist, so I'll just put it on the table for a start.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
So I don't want to get too much into the economics, but I mean the general rule of thumb, isn't it, with allocated efficiency, is that you're distributing out your resource in a way which maximises the return, the net return to the people, to the community, and so we can't actually shuffle the water around in a way that's actually going to make people better off. That's ultimately we want to get to. That's ultimate efficiency. We know we've got the best bang for buck, if you like, for the way we've distributed our water, in broad and simple terms. So that does take into account both the costs and the benefits. So it is a complicated equation in reality. People talk about it as though it's quite simple, but it's a complicated thing. I guess what I'm just saying here, though, is there had been, it seems to me, an assumption. If you believe that that's what we should be doing, and that, as I say, the RPS suggests that, and Section 32 suggests you should be considering this, then there should be some explicit consideration of that. And it seemed to me there wasn't that. There was an assumption here that if we just keep people where they're at, that's going to be allocatively efficient. When probably in reality, that's probably highly unlikely. I mean, I think probably giving some more to some and less to others is probably could end up making society, communities better off. And I'm not saying I have the answer to what that is. I'm just saying that that's a consideration that ought to be done. And if you are allocating in a way which would mean that large, long-standing, significant employers in the region, are going to be struggling to continue a business at the same scale, then that would be a fairly significant thing to take into account when you're considering what an efficient allocation would be.
Yeah. But also, and I'm aware of the fact that LCL is a little different, arguably, than wine growers or croppers. Or I mean, your issues are the same but different, in my mind, anyway. And that's partly why I asked that question. I mean, do you see that allocative efficiency issue being different for farmers as opposed to your industry and others?
Well, I guess this is, if I'm understanding the question, and forgive me if I'm not, but I guess this is why I mentioned scale in there, because it's a hard question to ask without knowing a lot about a lot of detail about both those industries and how much they contribute to communities and how much return they get per litre of water they use. But it's that kind of analysis that I would be useful to be able to see. I mean, I don't want to comment too much on the wine growing industry. I don't know much about how they operate or what their issues are. I guess all I can really say is that, I think it's pretty obvious that curtailing the ability of the GHL plant to continue to grow, or worse, requiring it to come down, would have a very significant impact on that particular plant. And whether that's how that compares to what the impact on wine growers would be, I'm really not in a position to say, I'm sorry, but I just think that it is a significant impact.
Okay, thanks very much.
Just see if we've got any more questions. I think we're finished. Thank you very much for coming in and presenting to us. Really appreciate you coming along and the amount of effort that's gone into the submissions and evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
We are ahead of schedule, which you don't often say. We're due back at 2 o'clock, so we're going to have a bit of a break and then lunch. And then we're going to have Hawke's Bay drinking water governance, unless they're here already. No, straight after lunch. Ulrig Limited at the break, and then Turamoe Farm, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, J&S White Contracting, then Big Hill Station to round up the day. Thanks very much. We'll see you at 2 o'clock.